This is a conversation between Joanne Brown and Mrs. Bessie Berry, recorded on October 28, 1989, at the home of Mrs. Brown for the Oral History Project for the Chemung County Historical Society. Mrs. Berry, when did your family first come here?
Well, Mrs. Brown, I alone came to Elmira in December 1952.
What brought you here?
I married an Elmiran.
When you came here the first time, did you meet him then, or did you meet him at another time?
I had met him, we were both students at Tennessee A&I State University in Nashville, Tennessee.
Now, is Tennessee your home state?
Yes, I am originally from Memphis, Tennessee.
And when you came here, did you live with a family here, or did you live with, maybe friends that you knew from here?
No, when I came, we were married, and we lived at that time with his family, Mrs. Sarah Berry.
Okay. What area did you live in when you came to Elmira?
We lived on the east side, in fact, at the corner of East 5th and Baldwin Streets.
What was your first job that you had here in Elmira?
My first job here in Elmira was approximately 1957, I believe. No, I'm sorry, 1956, when I decided, since I had two small children, that I wanted to do some part-time work. I went to the New York State Employment Office and applied for part-time work. And I started part-time work at the employment office itself, working as an employment insurance claims clerk. After that time, I worked at Trinity Episcopal Church for approximately 6 weeks, helping a fundraiser to set up an office and run a fundraising campaign for 6 weeks. After that time, I was assigned to the Chemung County Probation Department doing secretarial work.
How long did you work at the Chemung County Probational Office?
Well, during that time, I was going in as employees were taking vacations. I worked their job while on vacation. And after everyone had come back, the then director, Mr. Ray C. Holbert, liked my work so much that he asked me if I would stay and work there full-time. I agreed to work there full-time and worked as a stenographer there for about 4.5 years. After that, I took a civil service examination for caseworker in the Chemung County Department of Social Services, where I worked there for 6.5 years. And then in '67, I went to work for the Chemung County Probation Department as a probation officer. I worked there as a probation officer and senior probation officer until 1981, when I was appointed counselor at the Elmira Correctional Facility.
Could you talk a little bit about your duties when you were a parole officer, probation officer?
Well, as a probation officer, I worked primarily out of Recorder's Court and Chemung County Family Court and Chemung County Court. court cases, conducted investigations, criminal investigations for both Recorder's Court and County Court. As a result of those persons placed on probation, I supervised them.
Okay, when you say you supervised them, did you have to go into their homes? What did you do when you were supervising them?
Yes, I supervised them in the office as well as made home visits, which actually included the whole family. And for the last 3 years, I worked as an intensive supervision probation officer, which was a state mandated position. And this program was primarily for those persons who had been convicted of crimes, and if it were not for the intensive supervision program, they would have been sent to state prisons.
Were there other black people working in the probation office?
No, as far as I know, I was the second probation officer, the first black female. The first black male was Reverend Horace C. Walser, who worked for a few years, and I think he left sometime in 1966, when he was transferred. He was the pastor of Douglas Memorial AME Zion Church at that time, and he got a transfer to another conference.
What was the ratio of white families to black families that you worked with?
Well, needless to say, most of the individuals that I supervised were white. Most of the convicted who were black usually received a jail or prison sentence.
Okay, so you're saying that
The percentage, I don't know the exact percentage,
Okay.
but the percentage of those whites who were supervised on probation was very much larger than those of blacks.
so it appears that a lot of the blacks who came through the system may have been put or incarcerated as to having some kind of rehabilitation before they were.
That's a fact.
When you first came to Elmira, what impressed you about Elmira? What did you like about Elmira?
Well, frankly, I had to adjust to a cold climate and also to a city this small. Memphis is a very large city, and so I did have to adjust.
Okay. Being black, did you find any difficulty getting a job?
At that time, I personally have not had problems getting any of the jobs that I had applied for, except the job at the Elmira Correctional Facility.
Okay. Could you talk a little bit about your, position there or how you started there?
Well, I had taken the examination for correction counselor for New York State Department of Correctional Services. Approximately a year after taking the exam, I received notice that I had passed the exam. And when I took the exam. I took a double exam, correction counselor exam, and correction counselor minority exam, which meant I was on 2 lists. I didn't think much of it because at that time I really wasn't looking for another job. I was quite happy at my job at the probation department. But I began receiving canvas letters from various facilities within the state. After a while, and I really did not want to uproot and move from Elmira. And I began to question in my own mind why I did not receive a canvas letter from the local state facility. And at the same time, I was rejecting some of these other jobs. And then I learned that you should really be careful when you're rejecting the jobs because they will only accept so many rejections and then you would no longer be considered. So I wanted to protect myself. And so I really didn't know how to go about making that contact. And so I wrote letters to state officials, governor, the commissioner of Department of Correctional Services, Affirmative Action Office of Correctional Services, the superintendent of the local facility, and the deputy superintendent for program services. I wrote all of these people asking for consideration for Elmira Correctional Facility inasmuch as they did not have one black correction counselor within the facility. And it is public knowledge that the rate of black and minority inmates is very high as compared to whites and other groups. Somehow I continued to pursue this because nobody was coming to me. And finally I started receiving telephone calls from the facility, from a correction counselor that I happen to have known, who advised me that they thought I was being considered. And then I would get another call saying they heard I was coming up there. Then they called and gave me a date I was supposed to be up there. In the meantime, I had never heard anything official for anyone. And finally, I made a telephone call there and asked for an appointment to talk with the superintendent, who was then Mr. Wilmot. I did get an appointment. It was not with Mr. Wilmot, but it was with Mr. Donald McLaughlin, who was the deputy superintendent for program services. And I was not quite clear on how that interview went, but we got through it. I feel that my interview consisted of my asking a lot of questions about the job itself and the work environment, etc., etc. And we finally agreed that I would come to work up there, and so on. That he wanted me to come on a certain date, but I had to give notice to my present employer. And we finally decided on a June 11th, 1981 date to begin there.
Okay, you said something about you had to take a test. It was for the correction counselor, and it was also a minority test. Is this the normal procedure, or I don't quite understand?
I did not know. I did not know any details, but it had been suggested that I take both of them. They were listed, but they each had its own number. So I just applied for both. correction counselor number so-and-so, correction counselor minority so-and-so. I ended up being on 2 lists, so that leads me to believe that there are 2 lists.
Okay.
In that situation, I assessed that I would be better off on both lists and might conceivably have a better opportunity to draw from that minority list.
Okay, so they
Yeah,
take
because
some of the
I was number 7 on the minority list, and I might have been number 50 on the other list.
Do you think that they may have just looked at one list when they were considering you, and maybe this is why it took maybe longer for you to be considered for the position?
Well, first of all, even if maybe so, but there was a need there was a need to hire a minority because there was a minority slot in Albany, okay, and that slot was not filled at Elmira, but someone else was in that slot.
Okay,
That
this
person was white.
Had they had other minorities to work in this same position, or were you the first?
No, I only recall being third.
The third, okay.
Many years ago, they had hired at 2 separate times black males as correction counselors. Both of those males were terminated. And since then, and that had to be 10, 12 years prior to 81.
Okay, so you were the first female, then,
Yes.
black female to get
Yes.
that
Yes.
position. Now, could you talk a little bit about your duties while you were up there?
Correction counsel,
Mhm.
as correction
As
counsel.
Yes.
I supervised oh 100 plus inmates as they were brought in after classification at the Elmira Reception Center. That's the classification center. So once they have been tested, once their crime has been evaluated, it is determined there what general population that inmate will go in. They may come over next door to the correctional facility, or they may go to a medium facility, or they may go to a minimum facility, but everyone would come through the reception center. As they were assigned over to the general population at Elmira, each counselor would get a certain number of inmates to supervise. And we would have to, take care of the needs within the legal bounds of the law of those inmates. We also would have to present them for transfer to other facilities when they met certain requirements, because the more time that they served, that time being reduced at some point would make them eligible for reduced security. Okay, so it's our job to continually evaluate our caseload, and we would have to give the presentations to Albany, making specific recommendations and reasons why we were making the recommendations.
Okay.
If they had family problems, we had to intervene on that also.
Did you have other employees that you supervised or who worked with you on this?
No, each counselor works independently. There were 2 senior counselors assigned in the department who actually supervised all of the counselors.
Okay, who were the senior counselors, do you remember?
The names, well, at that time when I went in, it was Mr. Sanford Barkers, who has since retired. Then there was Thomas Gordon, who was my supervisor.
How did you get along with the supervisors?
I got along with the supervisors very well. At the beginning, when I first went there, I was a little apprehensive because I had never worked in an enclosed environment like that. I was used to doing field work, making home visits, okay, doing lots and lots of reports. I had to do that there, and also assign inmates to appropriate programs. What was the other part of that question? We had the 2 supervisors.
I asked, how did you get along with them?
I got along with my
Mhm.
supervisors and also my coworkers. I got along with supervisors, coworkers, inmates very well.
What was the number, did you have a large number of black inmates coming to you as opposed to maybe white inmates or other minorities?
Well, I didn't have a choice now. The inmate that I got, but because of the percentage of black minority inmates, of course, everybody's going to have a larger percentage of blacks and minorities on their caseload. I did have outside requests from other inmates because I was a novelty there, and of course, everybody wants this black counsel, but it just couldn't happen. And many times I had to explain to inmates why I could not do certain things, for them because I refused to tread on another counselor's ground. But I explained it to them, they finally, understood and backed up.
How many counselors were there?
I would say approximately 10 to 12.
And how many were minorities other than yourself?
It depends upon how you want to describe a minority. Because
Okay,
we had one
maybe Puerto
counselor who was a
Rican.
Jewish. We had no Puerto Rican.
Okay.
A couple of years after I started up there, no, maybe 3 years after I started up there, when I got, whom I had heard was the first female. Soon after I was there, she transferred to another facility, so that left me, the only female. Somewhere around 84, 85, maybe, another white female was hired, transferred from another facility, and she had specific duties. She specialized in group counseling, and so she established groups, and she did that full time. The rest were white males, with most of them having been former correction officers.
So I won't say you were the only one, but you were one of those who was not a former correction
Yes.
officer.
Yes.
Mrs. Berry, you said that you were not a correction officer before you worked as a counselor up at the correctional facility. Did you find any difference in attitudes among those who were officers or had been officers and those people who weren't?
Well, my personal opinion is that once you have been trained insecurity that it's embedded, and you are more security conscious in any area of work than you are social minded and sensitive to the needs of the inmates. And yes, I did observe a difference in the attitudes of the security people as opposed to the attitudes of the civilians.
Would you say that maybe those who had been officers previously were not as secure or didn't feel as secure with the inmates as maybe you did coming out of a civilian situation?
Well, I think that we would tend to look at the inmate in a different light, and as when you're security oriented, that is the first priority, even though we know that the primary we know that we must think in terms of the safety and security of inmates as well as employees.
Mrs. Berry, did you find it was that you had an opportunity to move up in the position that you were, that you had an opportunity to go into a higher position?
There are definitely opportunities existing within the Department of Correctional Services. And I did have an opportunity to apply for a provisional promotion. There was a position of the inmate program coordinator. It was a new position that was implemented into 12 correctional facilities within New York State. Since these were newly created positions, then persons were selected to fill those positions. I was fortunate enough to have received the appointment at the Elmira Correctional Facility, and out of the 12 coordinators throughout New York State, I was the only black and one of approximately 3 females. We did receive adequate training on how to implement this newly created program within the facility. However, the Elmira Correctional Facility traditionally was not as cooperative with Albany mandates as some of the other facilities. The job of the coordinator was to return to their facility after training and develop a program, a policy on inmate programming, as well as a policy on inmate payroll. One of my problems within that realm was that I felt I did not receive adequate or receive cooperation from my fellow co-workers, as well as my new supervisor, the Deputy Superintendent of Program Services, in trying to get these new policies implemented. In fact, I had given the Deputy Superintendent a draft copy of the proposals or the policies that I had developed, and for almost a year those policies had not been reviewed by the executive team and signed by the superintendent, so that we would then have written policies to abide by. And I had to spend almost a year trying to implement a new program without the written policies. This, for me, developed into a very difficult situation, and the end result was my suffering from stress, becoming ill, and I was forced to leave my job because of this illness in May of 1987. I learned that these policies were signed only approximately 2 months, 1 to 2 months prior to my leaving. I understand, or I feel, that the reason the policy was signed then is because an investigation had been begun on the facility relative to a class action inmate suit.
Mrs. Berry, would you please continue your conversation about the inmates' actions against the Elmira Correctional Facility?
I was just saying that I believe that the reason that my policies were signed at the time that they were was because I discovered there was a class action suit against the facility charging harassment and discrimination in assignment to programs.
Now, once this was put into action, were you able to carry on your job?
By that time, it was a little too late for me because I had been experiencing illness throughout that year, and since this was now March, I had an opportunity to use these written policies during the month of April and May, and my last work day was May 29th of 1987.
When you terminated your position or left the facility, was anyone else picked up, another minority for this position?
I did not leave the facility. I was off on sick leave, thinking that possibly I would return to work at any time. However, because of the seriousness of my condition, I was unable to return to that position within the 1-year period that's stipulated by civil service. During that year, they had the education supervisor, Mr. Ed Brusso, who worked as the coordinator for that period. After I was unable to return to my position within the 1 year's period of time, I was terminated from that position. At that time, another person of African descent, a Mr. Otu Obat, was hired provisionally in that position, and he still is presently in that position. Mr. Obat has contacted me on at least one occasion to express his concern about the problems that exist with the job, as he's experiencing some similar problems, even though he now has written guidelines from which to follow.
I'd like to talk a little bit about, I understand that you ran for the school board and that you were on the school board. Could you tell me a little bit about what year you ran and how long you were on the school board?
Yes. I believe that in 1964 there was discussion within the minority community to select a candidate to run for the school board. Prior to that, I think there had been several blacks, including a Mr. Lewis Stark, who had run unsuccessfully for the board. And in 1965, Reverend Horace C. Walser, W-A-L-S-E-R, who was then pastor of Douglas Memorial AME Zion Church, did run unsuccessfully for the school board. In 1965, I personally approached Reverend Walser and asked him if he would consider running this year, 1965, for the school board, but he felt discouraged and refused to serve as a candidate that year, and I informed him that I had been approached to run as a candidate, and that if he were not going to run, that I would. I did run, although I did not win that year. I did very well as far as the vote was concerned. So I felt that when you're entering something new, that because you did not win the election does not mean that you have lost the battle. And so after talking with many people within the community, I decided to run again in 1966, at which time I did win a seat on the Elmira School Board. I served 5 years, and during this period of time, we had presented a resolution to the Elmira City School Board to pass a resolution designating January 15th as a holiday in honor of the late Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We were unsuccessful in getting that passed through the board, but there were several in the community who were interested, and we continued to talk and to meet with and to pursue this matter. Finally, the board did vote to declare January 15th as a holiday honoring Dr. King. By that time, my 5-year term was expiring, and I was encouraged to run again for a second term. I did run, and I did win, therefore serving 2 full terms or 10 years on the Elmira School Board from 1966 to 1976.
Okay, you said that we worked in trying to get the holiday for Dr. King. Excuse me, can you maybe mention some of the people who worked with you on this?
Well, we formed a committee, and at that time, John Bryant served on the committee, Michael Barclay served on the committee, Bradley Scott, who's a Spanish teacher at EFA, Patricia Aaron, those are the persons that I can recall who served on that committee to actively pursue this matter.
Okay. You became a member of the school board during the civil rights era. Did you see any changes before you left? You said you were on the school board for 10 years. Did you see any changes from 1966 to the time that you left the school board?
No, I'm not sure I understand exactly
Okay.
what you mean, any changes.
Did you notice any changes in maybe attitudes of members of the board from what they were in 1966 when you first became a member? You were the first black woman to, and maybe the only black to get on the school board or to be voted on the school board.
Yes, I was
Mhm.
the um, first black to win an election
Mhm.
um, for the Elmira School Board district. Um,
When you first came, when you
W-
first
we-
became a member of the board, what were some of the attitudes? Were there any attitudes by you being the only black there, or was there any difference?
well, I felt that unless I brought specific issues to the board, that things would just go on as normal. I was just another member of the
Mhm.
board. I had received some negative input, but I could never clarify where it was coming from or exactly what the real problem was after the day was voted in. But there was so much outside support um, for that day. For instance, there was support coming from the teachers' unions. There was support coming from AFL-CIO, there, from the church organizations, churches, and outside organizations such as NAACP and other organizations within the community. So I would say that that was an issue that drew community-wide support. But somehow I still got the feeling that what we had done had somehow left a scar.
Okay, you're saying that some of the board members didn't really agree with you on this.
Some of the school personnel, I'm saying that some of the board members did not agree with that move. And I felt that they were responding to public pressure.
Who was the superintendent at the time that you became a board member? Do you remember?
Oh dear, Dr. I remember Dr. Zacharin, who was was the assistant superintendent. Superintendent, oh, I'm sorry, I cannot remember his name, but I recall his leaving for another job not too long after that.
After you were elected?
After the Martin Luther King Day was proclaimed and my subsequent re-election to the board.
Okay. And then who took his place was
Dr. Zacharin.
Okay. And when this day was put into effect, was Dr. Zacharin the superintendent at that time?
No,
It had happened
the previous, yeah, but he was there as assistant superintendent. So, and he always supported it. He was one of the supporters. Then the following year, interestingly enough, I brought the issue up of the Martin Luther King holiday for that following year. And it appears that it was going to fall through the cracks that second year. And I had to put a new vote on the table, a new motion on the table to vote on that holiday for that following year. So that was the one thing that I had to continue watching each year to make sure it got on the agenda for a vote.
Okay. So am I to understand you to say that you had to vote on it every year?
We did at that time.
Okay, in
Yes.
order to keep it in effect.
Yes. And at that time, we were the only school district, to my knowledge, in the state that had declared January 15th a holiday.
Okay. Were there any, while you were on the board, were there any other blacks elected to the Board of Education?
Well, the following year after my re-election, Miss Delma Rouse was elected to the board.
Do you know what year that was?
Somewhere around 72, 73.
Mm-hmm.
I think I was re-elected 71, I think. I would really have to check my minutes. And then the following year, so we did the 71 and 72. And then the following year, Mr. Rouse was elected to the board. And we served together for, 4 years? Because I served a year, then he was elected. And then 4 years later, my term had expired.
So he was the first male to be elected
Yes.
then?
Yes.
Did attitudes change having a second black on the board, or was it just the same?
I always felt it was just the same.
Now, we were talking about voting, and I didn't ask you, when was the first time you voted?
I have been voting since I became the age that I could register to vote, and that was 18. I started voting when I was in college. And then when I came to Elmira, I registered at the Board of Elections. So I've been a registered voter since I have been here.
What party did you vote under?
I registered, for the most part, I have been a registered Democrat, but there have been intervals, brief intervals, when I have been a registered Republican. I can't give you specific dates, but I'm presently a registered Democrat.
Did you vote in the 1960 election that elected John Kennedy?
Yes, I did.
Did you vote for Mr. Kennedy or President Kennedy?
Yes, I did.
Why did you vote for him?
Well, I voted for him as not so much because of the party, but because of the man. And I felt that his program involving women and minorities sounded like he was at least making an effort to support women and minorities and work in their best interests, at least to include all of us in the American society.
Do you remember the day that he was assassinated?
I remember the day, but I can't remember the date.
Okay, no, not
No.
the date, but do
Yeah,
you remember,
I remember the day.
where you were that day and how you felt?
Yes, I was on my job, and I was working in the Protective Service Unit at the Department of Social Services at the time, and I just remember that as being a very shocking news that day, and everyone was just sad that this had to happen, and it did interfere with the work going on in the department that day, and everybody appeared to feel the same way.
You also mentioned Dr. Martin Luther King, that you were a supporter of him.
Yes.
Did you participate in any of the marches, or did you march on Washington?
No, I was not able to attend or participate in that march on Washington in '63, I believe. I was not able to. I made some contributions, financial contributions, but I was unable to attend the march.
During the civil rights period, was there much involvement in the community with civil rights in the black community?
I don't recall very much being done. I do know that there was a period when Mr. Lou Stark was president of NAACP, that there was a lot of activity through the Elmira branch NAACP and trying to improve the job situation with minorities in this community. That was during the time that my children were small, and I was active in a few organizations, so I had to more or less limit myself. I was a working mother. I was raising those children alone, and I was not too active in a lot of organizations, at the same time. So I was, even though I participated, I was not that involved during that period of time where it took me away from the home.
Okay. I understand that you were one of the past presidents of the NAACP, that you did become involved with that later. Could you tell me a little bit about that?
Well, I did agree to serve as first vice president under Reverend Gregory Jackson, the pastor of Monumental Baptist Church. 7 months before Reverend Jackson's term expired, he was transferred. He received another appointment in New Jersey. I did agree to, as first vice president, to assume the presidency to complete his 7-month term. At the end of that period, I did agree to go ahead and run for president for a term which is 2 years. I served as 2 years. At the end of that time, it was difficult to find someone who would agree to run for president. I ultimately and reluctantly agreed to serve until they got someone else who might be interested. And that never happened. So I ended up beginning that second 2-year term. I got through 87, 88, this was during the period I was ill, and in 88, we did not have a first vice president, so I solicited the assistance of a Mr. Roosevelt Branch, who came on as our first vice president, and I had to relinquish my duties at that time because of my illness, and he completed that year, 88, 89, for me. And I was hoping that in December of 88 that he would run for his own term of presidency, but because of difficult scheduling and his limited time, he would not. Mr. Art Keith had been expressing for years his desire to become the president of NAACP. So he was elected in December of '88 to serve 2 years.
Were you the first woman to serve in this position? The
No.
first woman in Elmira Corning Branch?
No, I wasn't, but I believe I was the first woman in 50 years.
So there was someone else who...
There were a couple of women prior to 50 years ago.
Now, did you find when you were working with the NAACP, were there a lot of grievances, or did you get the support from the black community?
Yes and no. We never did have the number of committees operating that we wanted to have operating and should be operating. And over the last 3 or 4 years, it has been difficult to get people stimulated, okay? And things were relatively quiet. We did not get a lot of grievances or complaints. It seemed to be relatively quiet. We got a few, and those few that we did get, it's always seemed to be dealt with through an employee who was an NAACP member of the company, of which, you know, they might be filing a complaint. As far as formality was concerned, we did not receive formal complaints, okay? But if and when we did, we tried to act on it. But one of the problems was, if you really don't have your functioning committees who are supposed to take care of certain areas, it ends up with a lot of the burden falling on one or two people who did not. And, you know, after all, this is a voluntary organization, and people have their full-time jobs, and so the time that they have to give is still limited.
Do you think this was because of the membership, maybe not as many people as you would have liked, that you didn't have the committees? I know you said some people have full-time jobs, but...
Well, you know, any time that, if you look at the organization of NAACP, you will see certain areas that really ought to be covered. There are, and when they're covered, they end up being challenging. And it was almost a fear of wanting to challenge the system of whatever, you know, in those areas.
Can I ask you what areas or what committees you
Oh,
think should have been in place?
Well, there are standing committees that we don't develop. They're developed from national down, okay? I'm talking about employment. There's an education committee, housing committee, voter registration, and we have done a very successful voter registration, and we were cited during this period after running if it had not been for our successful voter registration, our membership would not have increased to the extent that it did that year, and I believe that was the year that Jesse Jackson was running for president. And we did get a lot of cooperation in trying to increase the voters, the voter registration. And Attorney Carl Hayden, who I'm not sure whether he was, I don't think he was chairman of the Democratic Party, but he was certainly part of that voter education registration. And he had publicly stated that NAACP was responsible for increasing the voter registration. We also have worked on voter registration when there were other elections, such as school board elections, too.
Do you think the NAACP helped to get you elected when you first ran?
When I first ran, I think they were part of it, but they were not my sponsor. Okay. But they did register support for me, as well as some of the other community organizations.
Okay, thank you very much for this conversation, Mrs. Berry. I really have found out a lot of information from listening to you.
You're welcome. I'm delighted.